Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back, and welcome to the first of a new year of the Center for Global Higher Education's webinar series. We hope you've had a good summer break and looking forward to resuming an exciting lineup that we have here. We're actually starting off the series today with a bit of a punch, and it will mark what is a three-part series on universities under fire. So you'll notice on our events page that we have, 12 webinars for the remainder of the year lined up, but three of those are part of this series, in which we'll be looking at the ways in which universities are being weaponized and are under political assault. So we are kicking things off today with Professor Shamit Sagar. He is the executive director of the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success, and is also a visiting professor at King's College London. And he'll be speaking to us today for about 30 minutes on the unavoidable weaponization of higher education. For those of you who are new to the webinar series or just need a reminder, the format is usually 30 minutes of presentation followed by 30 minutes of discussion, Q&A, and so that's your opportunity to reflect, to push back a bit, and Shamit has even asked for your reflections and your provocations. So we would like to make the most of that time. So while he's presenting, do give some thought to some questions that you'd like to put to him, and your critique, if you will, of his argument, which he's looking forward to sharing with you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Shamit to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Lee. So as I'm doing that, it did occur to me, I came online a moment ago, and I think I've actually just popped up the wrong presentation. But I will correct that as I'm talking to you, sort of multitasking if I can for a moment.
Great. Okay.
Easier than done. So look, first of all, I can sort of thank people. Thank you for the invitation, David. I know he's not able to join us, the director, and thank you, Lee, for stepping in at short notice. And in the background, I think Francis and Chris have been instrumental in making sure this actually happens. You are going to test my ability to speak, and it's often better just to spend a tiny moment and get it done. And let me double check this is the right one. There we go. That's open. So if that is open, we will now share, and with luck, the right one will be shared. Give me a moment. Well, as ever, it conspires against you. So why don't we just go back slightly and pretend as if I didn't notice the wrong one, and we'll just go with the wrong one, which I'll make the right one. I'm sure we can make a success of it. Look, while that's loading up, I don't know if colleagues can see. Can you see the opening screen now, Lee?
We can. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So albeit, look, I mean, it was slightly tweaked or based upon an earlier sort of presentation. So I think not all is lost. Okay.
That's good.
I would like to, before I go any further, I'm an academic from the UK, but spent the last 6 years in Australia down under. So if with your permission, Lee and others, I'd just like to acknowledge that the place I normally work at in Perth in Western Australia is the traditional owners of that land are the Wajak Noongar people. And if not that I'm speaking to you from that location, but we do like to acknowledge the fact that that land was never ceded following colonization and settlement. And that we naturally pay our respects to the elders of those communities, past, present, and future. Now, today's presentation or this talk is in three parts. And I think Lee alluded to it a moment ago. So I think having a sense of universities under fire is exactly it, isn't it? I mean, we're all interested in that. This is one of those very strange moments when, of course, the bibliography becomes the biography and past becomes your sort of academic interest of today. I went into this game, this profession that we're in, so this can be terribly boringly, but I think it's going to be relevant here, in the mid-1980s. as a kid, barely in long pants, so to speak, and I've risen up the ranks. And I think it never occurred to that generation of academics, and perhaps generations after, that we'd sort of be thrust on the front page of newspapers and elsewhere and get caught up in, amongst other things, what we call culture wars nowadays, and become a kind of contentious industry, a sector in of itself. I think most of us are being guided by the idea that there's knowledge to be discovered, there's knowledge to be curated, and there's knowledge to be shared and reflected upon. These sort of values seem to underpin what we do, without an acute sense that these might become contentious. The act of doing that, not necessarily what they produce, but just the method, as it were, that we take. And yet here we find ourselves in an age where we are a contentious industry, but so are other aspects of the knowledge economy and the cultural industries. So we're in sort of good or bad company, depending on your point of view. So this point about universities being under fire is not to be taken lightly by any means. So with that in mind, I think there's sort of three things I'm going to share with you, and primarily I'm going to sort of interrogate the disputes that have broken out. And I've been really very interested to hear colleagues' response to that. This is just me sort of thinking about our profession, our industry, and what we do, and trying to tie it together. But the vast majority of people here earn their living through sort of reading and writing, so to speak. They're part of the same industry. I'd be very interested to get a sense of what the rank and file, if I can call everyone that, what their reactions are. So we're going to look at the fact that we've got here, not in any old story, but there has been increasing ideological ferment and polarization. We're going to look at the disputes as they strike me, but I'm interested in that feedback. And then lastly, I think if there's some discussion, it'd be lovely to talk a little bit about what this may lead to and how one may respond to this. So in those three parts. So move on. To cheat for a moment, because time is always against us, I've taken the liberty, and you're very welcome to circulate these slides, Lee, afterwards, to sort of condense my argument down to just a couple of points, okay, just in case we sort of don't get there. You don't need me to read these out for you, but I'm just making the point that reiterating that from a variety of angles, there are arguments about what we do, how we do it, and the implications upon ideological coherence in a society as well as social cohesion. And there's a couple of sort of summary arguments there. So the other point I want to make here, I think, just at the outset, okay, is that if I just concentrate on the middle part of this slide, is that the higher education sector itself has been transformed. I mean, it is a very different sector, certainly here in the UK, as compared when my generation would have started. We've gone from a situation where we were fabulously undermanaged, in fact, managed at all. Vice chancellors were picked in a moment of absent-mindedness by secretaries of state, or often prime ministers, in fact, once upon a time. It was a badge of great pride to be appointed the leader of a university, but no one particularly, because it wasn't what we did, inquired about the managerial acumen of either that leader or what he or she represented. Anyone listening in or watching in this afternoon will know that's completely inverted. We are a highly managed sector in many ways. I'm sure people have got their own personal views about that, probably quite negative. But let's just remember that that's been a large part of that. And as part and parcel of that, of course, there's been an emphasis upon the what I would call a kind of utilitarian views of the purpose of higher education. And there are many people on this call who will be experts in that field, and particularly around the sort of labour market aspects of, what's a graduate premium. There was a piece, I think, in The Economist a month or so ago, talking about the collapse of graduate premiums in many higher education systems in the Western world. And these are to the fore. So we've got very sophisticated ways, I imagine, nowadays of sort of measuring that. So the education sector has changed, and with it has come what I call the rise of a managerial class. So if you want to lead a university in the UK or in comparable sectors around the world, you are steeped in modern management, for better or for worse. Okay. The second thing I think is that, particularly here in the United States, this conflation with what the knowledge economy does, universities doing specifically within that, and the creative industries, all these things are now sort of being merged together. And I think there's an open question. That's why I put a question mark here, which is that is it the universities are under pressure, or is it a wider set of sectors that are doing similar and complementary things are also under pressure. One may put up an argument to say that it's an assault upon knowledge itself, or the exercise of creating and interrogating knowledge, and that's not limited to universities in a narrow sense. And then, like I said, there's a kind of personal dimension to this, okay, in terms of the fact that I spent my career, of course, in many different universities in different countries. And I make the point only lightly but firmly that the spread of modern management techniques and even, may I say, mantras has become quite well established in a sector that was, borderline a kind of cottage industry once upon a time. Not so long ago in the UK, universities on the basis of a gentleman's agreement did not compete for students undergraduate level. As recently as 25 years ago, that would have been the case. I happen to be in London. If you jump around to London tube stations this afternoon, as I was yesterday afternoon, you'll see no end of universities telling you come to X, Y, and Z, and all sorts of promises are made. So, we've moved to a kind of very strong consumerist culture, to say the least. People have their own views of that. I'm just observing the changes and making sure that we recognise them. Now, let's move on. What I've tried to do here is condense what I think are a lot of arguments and get them down to sort of a manageable number of disputes. Now, this is where I say to colleagues, I'm very interested not just in your sort of response to this, more of this, less of that, agree or disagree, but also how this is brigaded. I mean, this is just me brigading these points, putting them together, and you may think there are some distinctions or conflations that ought to be otherwise. I think the first is, and I think this is, how can I put it, to be taken quite seriously, certainly in the US, that quite a lot of the elite institutions, fee-paying institutions who've got kind of, very high fees and so on, market sort of driven fees, as it were, have clearly been caught out. There have been a number of arguments and disputes about not just legacy students in the US system in very expensive colleges, but some of the culture of entitlement that's gone with that. And I see a sector that is not prepared for the criticism that it's sort of received. There's been quite a lot of criticism on the pages of the New York Times and elsewhere about the extent to which an unresponsive, globalized elite has emerged on the back of those institutions. And then more, close to home, there have been, just as it were, sort of just about within living memory, big disputes about what I would call sort of shortcomings in the governance and the checks and balances within universities. So we have the UEA crisis, I suppose, about the allegations about suppressing research to do with climate change. We have, more importantly, the LSE dispute about taking money from the Gaddafi family. I think it was a son or a nephew by memory, as part of a PhD program and so on. All these have caught out leaders of universities in being unable to come up with a response as to why this is taking place. Now, there's an argument, of course, as you may be aware, that all this, of course, suggests that some of parts of our university system or sector have become analogous to a luxury good. They become associated with the lifestyles and the ambitions of a very, very privileged globalized elite. And we can see institutions that are part of that. There's no dispute about that. The question is, has it been done sort of knowingly in terms of chasing kudos, fees, donations, associations, or has it been done sort of almost absent-mindedly, and in which case it's difficult to see about where the accountabilities go. But I just put that point out there. The second is a different dispute, I think, which has been kicking around for a long time, which is the association between universities on the one hand, universities and what they do on one hand, and liberal progressive values on the other hand. Now, there's been a number of studies being done over this, and I sort of pore over the findings of the latest studies that try to sort of flesh out issues to do with causality, the degree to which there is a liberalizing influence, and in fact, is there a higher education effect that's separate from a kind of cohort or even a generational effect? Now, I think we know that already. The point I would make in addition to that is that, of course, universities, this is where we get this point I'm trying to make towards the end, which is the unavoidableness of it, which, of course, universities, by their very nature, would be to say, well, we are in the business of dealing with the contestation of ideas. It's not just ideas, but we are quite enjoy and we're quite good at sort of pulling them apart. We like to interrogate, and that is part and parcel of the academic method. We build upon the knowledge of colleagues, and whilst it may come across as being quite confrontational, the style, as it were, the higher purpose or the underlying purpose is one of trying to tease out important distinctions. Now, critics of that, in turn, might turn around and say, of course, these are distinctions without differences. It's buried in our method, it's our culture. But, professors muttering into their beards to one another, barely hearing what they're saying, never mind their colleagues. I'm just rehearsing these stereotypes, not necessarily my views. But it is a setting, nonetheless, for this. So if the effect of it has a liberalizing effect or a progressive effect, it would be no surprise. Many of us would say, well, that's probably a good thing in many respects, that the one is teaching students an approach to dealing with facts as they see them, and how those facts have been assembled matters as much as what the facts are telling us. And we roll that up into our interpretation of all that. And then there's a related point. I'm trying to bundle a lot of things together, so do give me your feedback, which is, of course, for some time, the sector has been accused of being an echo chamber, that frankly, it's not been, well, it's been hostile territory to those, in fact, who don't subscribe to these subliminal progressive values and direction of travel, and you can create a kind of hostile territory for certainly cultural conservatives on many campuses. The second time I mentioned The Economist, I didn't really come on to this to bang on about them, but they've been pursuing this, I think, for about a decade or two, this argument, well before the match was lit, I suppose, in terms of universities being under fire today. It's been a concern for some time. But we can come back to that, okay? Now, where am I? Moving on. Thirdly, and this is, in a sense, my current job that I occupy, which is essentially the widening participation agenda, as we call it in the UK, student equity in Australia, creating opportunities and so on. So the idea that the academy should be for a mass clientele, not for a tiny minority. And of course, in the UK, as many will know, this goes all the way to Lord Robbins' report in the 1960s. I myself, of course, am a beneficiary of that. As a young adult, as a kid, I went off to a plate glass university in East Anglia, and was taught by many eminent people. But as part of an exercise that probably, well, almost certainly would not have happened had Lord Robbins and his committee in the 60s not concluded that not only would a higher education be beneficial to a larger cohort of young Brits at that time, but also that there would be important benefits for society as a whole, both in terms of economic productivity, but also in terms of the quality of that society. So that's a very noble. If you've got time, go back to Lord Robbins' report. This has been, of course, rehearsed a number of times in the 60 or so years that Robbins wrote his report. Now, the point I would make within that is that the route to get to that, or sorry, the road to get to that has been somewhat different in different countries, as it were. Now, in Australia, where I happen to work right now, it's heavily tied up with a kind of national culture of sort of procedural and maybe even substantive equality of outcomes. Very strong emphasis of there being or removing obstructions to or barriers to fairness in any markets that we see them. Now, this is the rhetoric, by the way, and just, policy, what it delivers, of course, is always a bit mixed. But it's heavily rooted in what colloquially we call in Australia the fair go society. The UK, I think it has somewhat different roots, and it's had stops and starts, but probably a highlight on this, a high point might well have been the decision with the sort of a stroke of a pen in 1992 of a Conservative Home Secretary to allow the former polytechnics to not only call themselves universities, but essentially try to present a single homogenous sector in which certainly universities would be doing different things, but to try to avoid the kind of apartheid of there being, established seats of learning, and then these sort of newer institutions that would be heavily geared towards mass delivery of mass higher education. So Ken Clarke's decision, I think, is something that's still very much with us, probably reinforced by Prime Minister Tony Blair's emphasis upon expanding higher education in the late 90s into the 2000s. Now, that's interesting. I think there's a related question, and this is just me echoing the sort of work I do nowadays, which is, well, has it worked? What's happened? I mean, how effective have these chapters or these attempts to reform the sector to be wider in its sort of in its embrace? Now, time prevents us to going into that in great detail, but I think one or two things worth bringing out would be to emphasize that until comparatively recently, universities would be typically led by a managerial class, would be led by university leaders who probably had only a very passing association with the nature of the policies and programs and practices that were done under the name of widening participation, student equity. And they would have an even scanter account as to whether or not they were working evidentially. The centre I lead now in Australia is a strong nod to that point, where the federal government has stepped in and said, well, we recognise they are struggling evidentially, and a single centre is then going to drive a kind of evidence revolution up to and including carrying out randomized control trials on different interventions and their effectiveness. Essentially, it's part of an evaluation culture. Now, the reason why I make that point and sort of emphasize and sort of labor it is that it's in common with quite a lot of other industries that find themselves questioned by government in terms of their performance in a particular area. Oftentimes, the government is keen to come in and, as it will, have higher levels of accountability and make sure the performance and outcomes are matching sort of some of the rhetoric. But at the same time, there's often is accompanied by an attempt to help the sector. And this is a good example of helping the sector. As a critic, you might say, well, universities should have been sorting this out for themselves, given they're spending large amounts of public money on these equity or widening participation programs. But it's a work in progress. Now, fourthly, and it's related to the progressive exuberance point earlier on, there's the allegation, of course, that some of our campuses have become, sort of no-go territories, or there's been a sort of a restriction of free spirit, freedom of speech. And that has in turn, of course, reflected the capacity or the ability of university students to become sort of almost self-radicalizing, possibly with the cooperation or the input of professors who are that much more thin-skinned than they perhaps should have been or would have been in the past about defending or having to defend the ideas that they are standing up for. Now, again, the evidence, I think, matters. I think the rhetoric has been, sort of quite overblown. In Australia, in response to the recent sort of Israeli-Gaza crisis, a report was commissioned by our current Prime Minister, and this is a quite common thing, you see, which seems to be saying that if certain universities are found wanting, and there's no elaboration as to what this would mean in practice, in terms of anti-Semitism on campus, that research funds, unrelated research funds, would be withheld from these universities by way of punishment. So that's a really good sense that, it's real. That people in favour of that argument in the Siegel report clearly have a very settled view that there is a sort of intolerance that's grown up. Now, many people on this call will, dissent from that and will have a variety of views. But make no mistake, there's a sense that universities have sort of incubated this almost deliberately. Now, just think for a moment, if you were going to take research funds away from the national sort of, disbursement of research funding centre, as it were, you would have to sort of come up with a very good argument to say why this trumped that. It's something would be deeply resented almost in itself by academics for what it's trying to achieve. But there you have it. We live in very, very polarized and difficult times. And with an eye on time, the last set of ideas I'm going to share with you, I think are sort of in the wrong order, but let me proceed. Let's take the middle one first. So what I call the neoliberal roots of modern universities, that we've probably been going on for quite a long period of time, assuming that the roots of what we're doing, the purpose, the mission of what we're doing is well established in society or in societies. And I think this varies. There's reason to question this. Again, it's a bit of an Australian point, but I think, we can think about reflecting on different systems. But there is a real question mark about how deep those roots are. There seems to be a history of expanding modern higher education in waves from the 90s onwards, but for strongly utilitarian reasons. State capitals lobbying to have their own universities to match what they're seeing in other parts of the country, to make sure that those are, as it were, sort of training grounds for upper middle class students to enter the professions, to match what they've traditionally seen in Melbourne and Sydney. Some degree of a mass widening participation agenda, but really the roots of that being quite scant. And what strikes you, of course, is the attention paid to the what we broadly would call the graduate premium. What's in it for us? Now, it becomes more accentuated in a country such as Australia, where there are relatively good returns, as it were, for students who do not attend higher education. The sort of what we call the kind of the skilled labour force, but not a knowledge economy labour force coming from universities. So that's important, but you combine it with the other point, of course, which is the rise of corporate managerialism. Universities having grown very substantially, having a very strong sense of where they can attract an additional marginal student, including, if I may say so, international students, and being highly instrumental in sort of chasing every additional sort of student in that regard. That may contribute to some of our problems, if I may say so. Now, ultimately, I make one substantive point, I think, which is a cultural point, is it not? That this point I was raising earlier on, that as academics, as professors, we are attached to our, not just our method, but our style of communicating with one another. I mean, it's a cheap sort of, jibe against academics that we speak, in paragraphs when we should be speaking in words. I'm sure I'm guilty of it right now. But I think the point is that it's not necessarily met with approval, societal approval. And it may, of course, be criticized or even resented that academics have become quite self-serving. I spent a large part of my career outside of academia and government. I think it's fair to say that that sort of stereotype of academics not necessarily concentrating on the outcomes of their work or the impact is very well established. Now, in more recent times in research excellence exercises, research ranking exercises, we've been, sort of weaned onto a diet of the impact agenda. So this is part and parcel of what we do, but it comes late. And I make it in slightly, joking terms that, of course, as a sector, we came out of holy orders. We were, monks before we were professors, and some of that still shows through. We should, in my view, this is my view, I'm very keen to have other views, to be sensitive about that and think a little bit about whether that is something that can be tackled, with some degree of change that's possible, but also the costs that go with the sort of style. But we're not the only profession that would be guilty of that. I spent many years regulating lawyers, and lawyers are criticised for whatever the equivalent is of talking in whatever and talking to themselves rather than to their clients. So we are historically thought of being as a producer-centric sector, like other traditional professions, and not being terribly consumer or user-centric. Now, that's all I want to say. Last point I want to put on the table is that, notwithstanding all of that, one still has to sort of take a view as to whether or not, as I put it quite provocatively, if you were trying to invent a machine today that was in the business on a very large scale, nationally and globally, to gather knowledge, to curate it, to interrogate it, to critique it, to share it, to distribute it, and then carry on doing that, and then to, of course, make sure that it's knowledge that we can stand behind, and we're always happy to revise our positions based upon further research and further inquiry. It would be difficult to invent a sector, not that one would literally be doing that, but I make the point in our defence, of course, that it may well be the best sort of machine or set of arrangements, which you can call a machine, that has been invented in the modern age that you could think of. Now, that doesn't mean that the methods and other points I've been raising don't need some degree of attention. But there is a point I'm making, of course, here, back to the leaders of our sector. I spend far too much time with them for my own good in Australia, about how one may sort of deal with this in response, making the case back that we are really a core part of the knowledge economy. We have been for a long time, and what we do and the criticisms that have been attached, there's an avoidable aspect to it and an unavoidable aspect. There's a bit of a balance, but that's really the subject of debate. Now, Lee, with that, I think I really will shut up. I've been promising to do so for some time. I'm quite interested to hear what people have got to say. Hopefully, it's been a sufficient provocation. But over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shaman. Yes, it was a fantastic series of observations, explanations, stereotypes, all of these fairly and unfairly leveled at the academy. I would love to hear from the audience as well, and so this is your opportunity now to push back. And so please, there's a Q&A tab at the top of the screen. If you just click on that, and then you can add your question there. And once you do, we can call on you, and you can turn on your microphone, turn on your video, and ask Shamit your question directly. So while the audience is thinking of some questions themselves, maybe I'll just take an opportunity to ask you, Shamit. Wanted to ask you about sort of the geographies of these frames that you're presenting to us. And I mean, most of it, I assume all of it is speaking to UK, US, and Australia contexts, where we have high participation, but also high fee models. And much of that, I think, might be at the root of a lot of the frustrations or criticisms that universities are facing in those countries. So I wanted to ask you whether you felt that any of these or all of these apply to maybe other contexts or other models, maybe other systems where you similarly have high fee, high participation, Japan and South Korea, or a more social democratic context. Do you see some of these same stereotypes still being thrown at them, even where fees aren't necessarily in the picture?
Yeah, so it's good, very good question, Lee. So I'm not an expert on countries beyond the three, or maybe if you throw Canada in as well. I'm not, that's my area of expertise. But I'm quite curious to see whether or not this sort of resonates beyond these sort of examples that I'm sort of focusing upon. And I suspect largely they won't, but there'll be odd exceptions and so on. Because of course, what I'm really talking about is the nature of what I'm trying to get at is not what we're doing, but how we're doing it, how we're being led. And these are very distinctive patterns that have taken place, that have been established. And I think there's been very little discussion along the way as to what some of these sort of the consequences of this might be. Now, a high fee and a high participation model, as you call it, of course, has been the route to the expansion of a quite limited number of universities to become quite substantial national and international players. And within that, if you're running a university, you're going to invariably sort of hire people who sort of do that at bigger and bigger scale. Now that's fine if you're from a kind of managerial, if you want a business development point of view, I suppose that you can understand that, okay? But there are larger issues at stake, and larger issues at stake have to do with our what we say in Australia, our social license, which is a complicated way of saying public approval and a sense and understanding of what we do, and so on. So I don't really know the answer to your question. I don't purport to be an expert beyond that, but I do make the point that it's what we're doing and the process by which we've grown to be what we are today. But I'd be really interested to hear in your view and indeed other people's views on these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Shaman. Doesn't look like we have any questions going on in the chat just yet. I think our audience are still working through a lot of those thoughts there.
I might bore people to death. I apologize.
No. I think they're coming out of their summer holiday haze. Yeah, indeed, a lot of the critiques apply specifically to, I think, as you say, systems that have expanded in light of marketization, in light of a model that demands user fees, and it makes me think though, a point you made at the end about the best machine invented. Maybe perhaps this is unrelated, but it was curious that you used the word machine to describe a sector, and that immediately made me think of AI and how AI could be coming from an angle and also challenging the sector in all those ways that you describe as being unchallenged up to this point as the best form of knowledge discovery, knowledge production, knowledge sharing, all of these things that that is AI also to blame in this? Is AI also perhaps a challenge to what you describe as universities being the best machine ever invented?
So it's a really good observation. It's very pertinent. So I've been thinking about this a little bit myself. I would answer it from the following angle, which was to say, given what I've said already, which is that if I'm running a university or big players within that sector, I'm going to be hiring a particular group of people with particular skill sets and experiences. So I would be thinking to myself that senior management teams are going to be very heavily investing in tooling up in AI. And I think that's happening actually as we speak. So in a sense, there's threats coming down the line, and like any industry, people are worrying about whether sort of professors' jobs are on the line. But the real challenge lies in terms of rising to this and seeing a kind of complementary nature. Possibly, I would have thought, dare I say it, a cost-cutting opportunity for universities. Professors are quite expensive and all the rest of it. Yeah. Now, no one really knows. There's experts working on this as we speak about what the sweet spot will be in terms of man and machine, so to speak, and learning, and what learning will become. I mean, it's really up for grabs. Okay, the whole thing is changing in front of our eyes. But I think I'm quite clear that senior management will be very much under pressure to rise to this and to be seen to do so. Um, and that suggests to me that the kind of academic values that implicit in what I've been articulating are likely to become even more squeezed. Academic values emphasize very heavily the idea of the integrity of the work that you do, the fact you stand, but you stand behind it, has your name on it, and that it is transparent, and that it is something that is open to contestation. These are very strong values, which we very rarely articulate ourselves. I could go on, but I'm sure people recognize what I'm describing. And it may well be that we haven't gone on about them enough, which is why we don't, we find ourselves in this position. So it may well be that AI is going to sort of go force us in one direction or another. But I think I see the commercial opportunities and the commodification of students even more when I see the AI challenge coming down the line for university leaders right now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's quite a depressing thing to say. I accept that, but that would be my sort of my view on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So would you say then it is that it is the responsibility of academics and university leadership to re-articulate the values to the public, to remind the public of what universities are for and how they are the better alternative to things such as AI? I mean,
Absolutely, I would go along all of that. Absolutely, exactly. It must be our responsibility. I mean,
mm,
if we are not intimately involved in and understand and able to articulate what it is we're doing, and the economic utilitarian benefits and the non-economic, non-utilitarian benefits of that, I do wonder who else will do that. The problem we have, of course, we have a managerial class, a leadership class, who are not very well skilled at that, are not particularly inclined to do that. If you look at the behavior of university leaders right now, it tends to be a much more instrumental game about trying to benefit or avoid problems with changing government policy and so on, and funding streams, all of which is understandable. They try to sort of protect their corner, but very little of it involves the promotion and articulation of what we're doing. Now, that's a really easy thing to say, on a Tuesday afternoon. I think a lot goes with that. I think the language we use and the illustrations that we have, and in speaking briefly rather than at length. And so I mean, I've had a number of examples over the years where I've seen that we've not been terribly well skilled at that. But to answer your question, I'm absolutely convinced. I've no doubt in my mind, if we don't have a strong articulation of that ourselves,
yeah.
we will be struggling. I really do.
Mm. Yeah.
Now,
No.
now on that, let's just these are all just interesting opinions, but let's just put some flesh on those bones. You would then ask questions about governance arrangements. of universities. And you say, well, what is the governance of? It's a university, but what is it? What's the nearest thing that it makes us think of? Is it's just standard non-profit? Is it for-profit commercial? Is it something else? Something else? Okay. So I think there's plenty to be done. I think in terms of having a good look at reforming that. There's a big governance review going on in Australia right now, and I think the subtext of it has been that universities have been far too quick in getting people who are far too close to business interests onto their governing bodies without thinking at all about the implications of that long term. So I think there's why to raise governance, because that would be the appropriate place, of course, for the governing body to say, are we happy with the approach of a senior management team, and are we happy that it's sufficiently grounded in academic values and so on and so forth? Because that's how it would take form. And if they weren't, they would lock horns. So it's not just opinions. You've got to think about institutions, how these things work through.
I see. Yes. Right. Okay. I'm being told by a member of the audience that there are quite a few questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
For me, it is a blank slate, and I think it's a tech issue or a permissions matter. Shama, can you see the questions?
No, I can't. No. Hang on.
That's
I've got the chat open.
Yes. And there's a separate Q&A tab, and it is appearing completely blank on my screen.
Same
So
I've got some questions in the Q&A tab.
yeah. Oh,
I can see some.
okay.
Do you want to just say it?
Yes, please. Let's do that. Let's have everyone. I'm very sorry about that. If everyone could paste their questions that they put in the Q&A kindly into the chat window instead, and just disregard the Q&A. Then we can get on with some of these questions that are coming in. Great. Okay. All right. Let's start with Glenn, since he was he put one there first. Glenn, do you want to come in and ask your question yourself and elaborate?
Okay, here I go. Please do excuse me. My camera doesn't work too well. I hope that I'm loud and clear. Professor, thank you so much for your interaction. It really stirred our thinking. It got us quiet for a few moments. But my question to you is, what configurations within academia or within education would you envisage for the future of higher education, with market forces being a control factor? Could you portray for us where the future is pointing, and how do we trace it? How do we either follow it or resist it?
It's a good question. So I'm inclined to say that it's going to depend on the kind of economics of that situation, is it not? So when universities, of course, have become quite dependent upon co-funding with government, with the state, it must follow that they need to be very good at that. They need to attract the students according to the rubric and the criteria. And then in this day and age, of course, student success and student satisfaction and so on and so forth. So that would be a kind of constraint. But you're asking a question about how this could be sort of dealt with at a sort of larger scale. The financial envelope within which a university operates could potentially be put sort of as one factor, and asking and expecting a senior management team to work within that, as opposed to it being sort of entirely financially driven. Now, universities, of course, they can't become loss-making exercises in of themselves, but a lot is going to depend upon how dependent they are on the taxpayer's contribution and what they believe they're giving the taxpayer, and therefore attracting students who believe they're getting the graduate premium and so forth. So I think that's probably the crux of it. Does that help your question, if I've understood it correctly? Is it there?
Yes, I mean, the financial factor is certainly one big consideration. But what about the external influencers? We've got China, for example, drawing and pulling and attracting. On the other hand, certain Western countries now have become very conservative with regard to international education, and thus and so forth. And I think, on the other hand, you look at an area like the Middle East, which is gap, a gaping gap, for the most part. And when we think about these three scenarios, for example, and then of course you might want to factor in the continent or the subcontinent of India, raring to go with a research potential and thus and so forth. How are we going to kind of rationalize the best approach that one could take towards providing that education which is liberating, that is, elucidating, that is illuminating, I'm sorry for sounding so philosophical, but I think that's the purpose of education, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and don't apologize at all. I mean, whatever the words are, I'm sure you're getting the point I was trying to make much better than I was. I think you're right. I think this has been lost somewhat, has it not? Which is the intangible. I hesitate to even say the word value, but the intangible aspects, qualities of education is not just, of course, the absorption of knowledge that's being collected and now shared by others. I mean, important though that is, it is the reflection of all those things and seeing, again, the value added or the multiplication effect of that, the fact it has a liberating quality. And these things are clearly what underpin the sense of an educated society, not only able to take on higher order tasks, but also to reflect upon that society and how those may be reconfigured. So it's the power of imagination more than anything else about ourselves individually, as communities, as societies, as nation states. So the language you're using, I mean, I would encourage all that. Now, given that we're on the same grounds on that, there's a larger point, which is countries all over the world, regions all over the world are investing enormously in their knowledge economies. I know the Indian case rather better than others. And the scale of building degree granting and PhD awarding institutions is quite eye-watering if you look at the standards or the targets of set as recently as 2020, which are more than half achieved for the end of this decade, despite the slowdown of COVID and those years. So this is, if you go back to the actual government documents that this is about in the case of India, it openly acknowledges the fact that India's future economic development in the middle 21st century will be hampered by human capital weaknesses, not just shortages, but actual weaknesses, an inability, I'm not sure what that noise is, an inability to rely upon existing institutions to produce the right quality and the right rigor, but also the problem about scale. There's relatively small numbers of future generations of Indians will be able to access this. So it's a whole nation building exercise, nothing much short of that. Now, having got that established, that's what we're talking about. More traditional university sectors or older ones have questions about how they will sort of partner or complement that. What I observe, of course, for the most part, is it's business as usual. This is a bit like expanding domestic markets, but now expanding into international markets. We wait to see about the university collaborations starting with Australia, the UK and others, and countries like India and China, about the extent to which these will be long-term knowledge, co-knowledge, co-production in terms of knowledge and so on, as well as the knowledge mobility. And some universities obviously are quite keen on establishing that. My own one, I think, Curtin University is quite a good example of this, where it's got 8 campuses in the Indian Ocean region, but it's trying to move away from a kind of commoditized model and try to have some sort of mobility taking place for postgraduate students and as well as academics. So all of this is taking place at the same time. But the unifying point, I think, is quite clear, that rising emerging economies have established that the real value added to their economies will be to shift to knowledge industries, and what graduates can then provide for that and to that will be critical. And at the same time, I think you're saying as well, there's a lot of intangibleness that goes with that. And that intangibility is critical, but we need probably a fresh language, maybe a fresh attempt to articulate it as part and parcel of all of this.
Thank you.
What else do we have?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know what? There's a question here about private universities, which I think kind of follows on nicely, and I wanted to give Wilco a chance to ask. Wilco, do you want to elaborate any further on that, or would you like me just to read it out?
Yeah, Lee, thanks very much, Amit and Lee. I think I just copied the question from the Q&A into this chat box for you to read it. But I would like to answer to that question too. I think it was James Kelly. I'm not sure if he's still in the audience.
I'm afraid I don't see a comment or question from James.
Sorry,
I see. Go ahead.
Apologies, the camera isn't working. I just had a question around to what extent you thought that the arguments you've been putting forward could apply to the private sector, and to what extent you think the arguments may change as the private sector expands and the public takes up a less significant proportion.
Very possibly, they may not apply to the same extent, but a lot would depend upon accountability and authority. So if you're running a private sector university, your governance arrangements will be what they are. Now, if you're backed by shareholder capital of investment of any kind, that will be important to trace that through and see what those priorities are and how they're articulated in day-to-day governance arrangements. And of course, I suppose you would expect to see different sort of rules of engagement around autonomy. So I saw this previously in an unrelated area in the legal service industry, where about 15 years ago we moved to a different model of being a solicitor's firm, and these alternative legal practices, yeah. And the concern was that the shareholder value or the investor interest might trump the legal interest, and the legal interest being the hallmark of it being the relationship between the lawyer, the solicitor, and their client. So the client must come first. So the clash of those potential interests, possibly even values. So I'd be interested in looking at all of that. And what I'm saying may not apply for those reasons, but which direction it goes, I don't know. But I'd be quite interested to see whether or not private sector universities were being established in order, well, it wouldn't be so explicit, but I'd be interested to see the extent to which what I call traditional academic values were being underpinned in all of that. I don't have any views one way or the other. I wouldn't particularly want to prejudge that. But a lot of what I'm describing will be able to be traced through on the governance and accountability regimes, I would have thought.
Thanks very much.
Great. Okay. So in the interest of time, we have we'll go right on to Yiran. Yiran, are you with us? I can read it for you if you like.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Sagar, for your fascinating sharing. And I wonder if you'd like to share your further insights in how to enable the just and open dialogues for innovation and enhance the university's transformability for transformative social change with the pluralistic methodologies in social research against the volatile post-normal science demands. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're going to have to help me with the question within that. Sorry, I understood what you're saying, but what particularly would be the question I might focus on?
Thank you. I wonder if there are some possibilities to generate the imaginative infrastructure for the enable the pluralistic methodologies in societal studies, which can enhance the transformability of the universities in response to the volatile post-normal science like climate change and some global grand challenges facing the intricacy and complexity and open dialogue demands. Thank you.
Yeah, so if I understood that correctly. So, I mean, my response would be it would be absolutely the right setting for a university, and different models, different systems, so on, would be the right setting to explore and examine all that. I mean, without the ability to try to examine that and embrace that, it would be difficult to sustain the idea that universities would have a value. Now, we say innovation, it's a word that's widely used in public policy. It's, bandied around and so on. It may be broken down to different things, but innovation also has the quality of thinking about reordering what you already have, not just recasting, but reordering those sort of the sequence of things or the amalgamation of things that you have in front of you. Now, is a university or a university system encouraging of that? Does it create incentives? Not necessarily formal, never mind financial ones, but in what ways culturally are we able to encourage that very very process of taking place. We're all very interested in innovation taking place in a control setting and try to extract the market benefits and sort of marketize that or commercialize all that. I think that's taken as read in this day and age. But to do it at source and be doing it all the time and that having value for students and their student experience is something that I think is undervalued. I really do. Now, our colleagues, how they go about doing that and the values and the systems within which they operate, especially around teaching, they will have to speak for themselves. And the gap between the university sort of leadership and this sort of happening in sort of day-to-day life in student settings is quite large. It's quite large. It's quite difficult to monitor this in any meaningful sense. But I would have thought what you're describing would be the heart of what we're saying. Surely it's the right setting for all of this.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. Yeah. So is the right setting. If not universities, then who? Okay. So yes. So we have let's go to Dave. Is it David? I think. Unless David, you were copying your question from someone else there. Apologies.
No, it was from me. And okay. In fact, you have hinted at some of the answers as you've gone through. But given that universities exist to serve society, and given that it's a happier situation when universities and societies are working on sort of friendly or at least constructive terms, what do you think universities might do differently to enable society to appreciate their value for society?
Excellent question. And it's not like we don't have many examples in front of us. So we have lots of universities and groups of universities who are leading directly into the question stroke challenge that you sort of within your comment there. So one argument, this is just one, but there's many, is that surely they should be sort of fairly strong players in local sort of regional economies, or indeed in urban renewal. And many universities, certainly here in the UK, have been busy sort of demonstrating that they can support different local industries or the local labour market, or indeed the sort of, if I may emphasise, the spin-off that came out of the UK industrial strategy, long abandoned, which is the analysis that British businesses lacked sufficient management training and acumen, and that UK universities could help to fill that, both at scale but also quality. In other words, a given business could be doing better if it was better trained and guided at the top. So all these things British universities, UK universities have been doing without a doubt. Partly as part of impact, partly in terms of local, regional sort of contribution. All good and well, no, not the hint of criticism. Separate but related point is that probably worth, if you were sort of drilling into this, take a quick look at how long they've been doing it, in a sense, how committed. And here I will sort of, descend into sort of, not anecdote, but single examples. Take Queen Mary on the Mile End Road, a phenomenally successful university in the last 20 years, but as recently as 30 years ago, existed in the poor East End and resented the fact that it was the wrong side of town. Now, I'm not going to share too many stories with you, this is a live sort of webinar, but you can see implicit in my voice, in the way in which I'm describing that, there's quite a lot of that. And I spent a bit of my career there, 15 years. And about the time that it was amalgamated with Westfield from Hampstead, a whole bunch of Westfield academics would come down to the East End. Of course, they were unhappy and cross. You can imagine that. And every stereotype you can imagine, every laughable situation was broadly true. Okay. So what I'm drawing your attention to is culture and leadership, and leaning into a local economic development relevance agenda. Great. But intentionally, knowingly, supportingly, or in a tactical way, in order to, as it were, garner brownie points. Now, maybe in the end it doesn't make a lot of difference, but I think it makes a bit of a difference, okay, where you are and recognizing what's out there. But I do recognize that certainly UK university has been very heavily involved in that. That then is reflected very much in how the university sees itself and indeed its mission. And it probably even gets filtered down to the kind of academics it recruits and the kind of students it recruits as well. It's difficult to demonstrate that causality, but I'm sure there's a link as well. So these are that's just one example of what universities can do. I could go on, but that's an obvious one that comes to mind. There have been attempts to sort of do that at scale. So universities sort of, getting together, as it were, as part of either trade associations or, sort of constellations or groupings and saying this is what we do best. Two questions arise. How good are they? So that's kind of an empirical question relative to the effort and time and money that's spent. And how committed have they been in a kind of cultural sense? Is there something that is well established and you can sort of see reflected in the sort of day-to-day sort of practices of university, rather than a top-down instrumental attempt to either curry favor or chase taxpayer funds?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Shamit.
Probably too honest an answer, I dare say.
We've had a lot of interesting and honest reflections here, and I actually would, by means of closing here, I wanted to ask you: what is this leading to? What are you producing a book based around this at the moment?
Yeah.
Or
yeah,
you are.
I certainly don't have the time for that, but I'm clearly intending to do that. That's why I'm keen on the comments that have been coming through. I'm very keen to hear from my fellow members of my profession.
Brilliant. We do look forward to it. There was one question we didn't get around to. I believe there was just one. There might have been more, but I apologize to the audience for that, for the tech issues. But Shamit, with your permission, I would encourage the audience to get in touch with you directly if they have burning questions or some further reflections on your talk.
I'd be delighted if they do. It would be very helpful to me. Hopefully, be helpful to them as well.
That would be great. Yes, we would certainly be continuing this discussion and continuing along this topic line. I'll just have a brief plug for the next webinars. We do have webinar every week moving forward, so we will be meeting again next Tuesday at 2 p.m. UK time. But I should also note that the University Under Fire series is scheduled bi-weekly. So the next part of this series will be John Aubrey Douglas joining us on the 16th of September, followed by Eve Darian Smith on the 30th of September. So I hope you can join us for those, and as well as the events in between. As I said, it'll be every week. So we're afraid we're going to have to wrap things up there. Shamit, I want to thank you so very much for your time, your reflections. Shamit is currently on leave and still agreed to do this, which we're very grateful for. So on behalf of the audience, I wanted to say thank you, and we're gonna close things there. So we hope to see everyone again in the weeks to come. Thank you, Shamit.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.